cases of human trafficking. These approaches entail the stabilization and reintegration programs that fully empower survivors to engage with criminal justice processes. We aim to share best practices such as independent advocacy models that can contribute to building capacity in this area. Now, this side event has been organized by Hope for Justice and the Uganda Youth Development Link. Hope for Justice is an international NGO working to bring an end to modern slavery and human trafficking. We were founded in the UK in 2008, but now there are more than 400 colleagues working in 30 locations across 5 continents. The work of Hope for Justice is based on 4 pillars: preventing exploitation, protecting victims, restoring lives, and reforming society. For example, we were involved in identifying and providing independent advocacy and support for survivors in Operation Fort, which you might remember as one of the largest criminal networks of human trafficking for forced labor discovered in Europe. Now, Uganda Youth Development Link is an NGO that works with young people aged 10 to 24, who are vulnerable to exploitation and at risk of HIV. The mission is to promote socioeconomic transformation of disadvantaged young people. Over the last 15 years, the organization has built a niche working in the areas of advocacy, identification, rehabilitation, and reintegration of victims of commercial sexual exploitation in Uganda. Now, before we start, I just wanted to take a moment to go over a couple of housekeeping points. Please mute yourselves and switch off your videos, and keep your questions until the end, or type them down in the chat as we go along. There will be a questions and answers session at the end. In addition, this event is being recorded, as you may have noticed, and will be made available through our YouTube channel at a later stage. Let me get started with our first speaker, Katarina Thon, who will be speaking on the importance of survivor-centered justice. Katarina works at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, where she is a program and capacity building officer in the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking for Human Beings. Prior to joining OSCE, Katarina worked as a child protection officer at UNICEF and an associate child protection officer at the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations. Katarina is currently focusing her work on training on survivor-centered approaches within the criminal justice system. So Katarina, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Enrique. The pleasure is truly on my side. And I want to thank the Uganda Youth Development Link and Hope for Justice for inviting our office today to speak at your event and to give us the opportunity to actually speak about the importance of survivor-centered justice and the importance of victim-centered approaches in the investigation and prosecution of THP crimes. And in fact, if you allow me, I want to quote one sentence from your concept note, which got my attention and that I want to use to start my short remarks. So what you highlight very well in your concept note is, justice is often viewed through the lens of conventional criminal justice systems, where the path to justice follows a clearly structured pattern, from police investigations to prosecutions to judgment and to punishment. So why am I highlighting this in the context of today's discussions? Because, of course, there is a consensus among practitioners that the victim-centered approach is an important one to follow, and it is a cornerstone of every counter-trafficking strategy. And of course, we all know that victim-centered consideration presents themselves to the criminal justice practitioners at all stages of the response, from the identification to the investigation, to the prosecution, to the trial, and then, of course, beyond. However, and here comes the but, while it may seem obvious that victims of human trafficking should be a priority at every step of anti-trafficking work, unfortunately, this is often not the reality. So way too often, cases are victim-built rather than victim-centered. And what I mean by it is that the burden of proof lays on the shoulder of victim because alternative ways of evidence may not be allowed in the court. And secondly, and closely linked to this, criminal justice responses tend to be one-sided, where they prioritize holding offenders, perpetrators accountable, which is, of course, relevant, which is fundamental, which is important, but which may not be the most important part for the victim, which may not be what a victim would say first when the victim speaks about justice. So the question is, how can we ensure a victim-centered approach to the investigation and prosecution of THP crimes? And here, of course, there's many considerations and many aspects, but I just want to highlight 3 of them. The first one, a victim-centered approach to the investigation and to the prosecution means prioritizing the best interest of the victims at all times, in all stages throughout the process. It means focusing first on building a relationship of trust to the victim, making sure you meet the basic needs first. And it also means paying paramount attention to the well-being of the victim, the protection and assistance of the victims, their safety. It also means setting aside stigma and stereotypes. And why I highlight this, of course, victim cooperation is not the end goal of a victim-centered approach, but I do want to highlight that experience has shown that a supported and a protected victim and putting the victim first can lead to stronger cases and therefore also benefit the overall judicial response to human trafficking. The second point I want to highlight is the importance of understanding the impact of trauma. For many criminal justice practitioners, actions or undertakings of the victim may seem irrational, they may seem unreasonable, and they're hard to understand. Why didn't she or he run away when he or she had a chance to do so? Why didn't he or she seek for help when there was an opportunity? Why could she still or he still say, but he or she was my best friend? But I love my trafficker, or I love him, I love her. So these to understand this for a criminal justice practitioner, it is hard. So the question is, what should they do about it? Because answers to those situations cannot be found in the book, they cannot be found in legislation, they cannot be found in law. But the key to these situations is to dig deeper, to take the time to speak to the victim, to talk to the victim, to understand the circumstances in which the victim is, to understand the surroundings, and to make the efforts to really understand the side of the victim and not to apply our own rationale and our own understanding on the victims, because this, in fact, might lead to dangerous conclusions or assumptions that might be harmful at the end of the process. And last but not least, answering these questions, how can we deliver victim-centered justice? And I think the word says it, means listening to the voice of survivors. It means taking the experience, the expertise of survivors into account when we develop victim-centered solutions to the investigation and prosecution of trafficking cases. And this is why we, as an office within the OSCE Special Representative for combating trafficking in human beings, we do not only advocate for a victim-centered approach within the criminal justice response, we also engage survivors within our work, both in the training, but also in the policy work. And I know that Malaika is with us today. And in fact, with this, I don't want to take too much time away and give the floor back to you, Enrique, that Malaika can start with their presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Katharina. And actually, you made my introduction to Malaika very easy, because I think you mentioned how important it is to have an approach to criminal justice which is victim-centered and not just victim-participated. So it is about all the stages, including investigation and prosecution, and not part of the process. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Malaika Oringo. Malaika is the founder of Footprint for Freedom, a survivor-led organization that works to break the cycle of human trafficking in East Africa and the Netherlands. Malaika is also a member of ISTA, the International Survivor of Human Trafficking Advisory Council, established by the OSCE. As a survivor, speaker, and campaigner, Malaika has highlighted gaps in European legislation and policy. She has also advised on best practices that can provide victim-centered, trauma-informed, and survivor-centered approaches to improve response to survivors' and victims' need. So Malaika, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I would also like to thank Hope for Justice and Uganda Youth Development Link for the invite. And thanks to Katharina, a lot of points you've mentioned really resonates well with me, especially from my journey as a survivor. Today, I just want to bring in a more of a survivor perspective on how to create a more survivor-centered criminal justice process, using the lens of my personal experience and the experience of the others that I've been working with. To most survivors, the cost of attaining justice is a long one, and it comes with a high cost of survivors getting re-traumatized and victimized during the criminal proceeding from the same institution that are supposed to protect them. I remember my first encounter with the law enforcement was one of my traumatic experience. That is over 18 years ago, but is still vivid in my mind. Due to the intensity and the duration of the interview, it wasn't clear to me, am I being identified or am I being interrogated? I wasn't ready, first and foremost, to open up my traumatic experience to strangers after just being rescued. And I had this associative disorder as a coping strategy. What does this mean? I did not identify myself as a victim because I just wanted to distantiate myself from what has happened to me in order to protect myself. But because of lack of this understanding of trauma and how it impacts survivors, and how these cultural barriers also impact survivors during legal proceeding, I wasn't a perfect victim in the eyes of the judges, which left me undocumented for almost 11 years. So this narrative of a perfect victim during legal proceeding, I feel that is ambiguous and damaging. Survivors do not have to be perfect for us to believe them. And they do not have to fit in every box that the justice system think survivors have to be, because survivor recovery and who survivors are is not a linear process. Everyone is different and their circumstances are different. So their cases should be also treated as such. In my experience, most human trafficking prosecutors often decide not to take cases or pursue cases because victims lack credibility, or during the time maybe becoming in the witnessing procedures, they are seen as uncooperative. And this makes it also question their credibility, or sometimes victims or survivors contradict themselves, doubt themselves to recount their victimization. And also considering that survivors and victims have to tell their stories from the legal proceed, from the law enforcement to the service providers who are going to take them in, to the health practitioners. It's just reliving and retelling your story is like the only way that your credibility of your victimhood is taken serious. Also, speaking from my personal experience, most young girls or girls who come from a history of abuse and neglect are not being heard. We've learned that tears and being vulnerable during legal proceeding is not going to give us justice, or is not going to help. So most survivors use numbness as a way to pass through this trauma, but it has led to misjudgment during court proceeding. And just like Katharina said, it's, the primary goal for all criminal proceedings should be survivors' first initial health welfare, and secondary to arrest and prosecute traffickers and perpetrators, but which is different. It's the other way around. It seems sometimes we put into a situation where we are just used by the criminal justice for them to get traffickers. And this has affected the way we portray ourselves, and especially because when a victim and a survivor first entry to justice or to freedom is meeting a law enforcement, and if you don't get a good experience, it affects your overall recovery. I also want to share some of the lessons that I learned working with other survivors and being a survivor myself. Justice for human trafficking victims and survivors has long been viewed in the lens of the criminal justice system with the most focus on punishment. But what they do not understand that human trafficking survivors, justice to them is more about healing, preventing more future harm or being in trafficking positions, and having access to restoration services. And what I've also noticed that even though here in Europe, we're having progressive legislations on anti-human trafficking, in practice, the legislation do not provide full protection when survivors become witnesses. And this has caused a lot of distrust for us to open up to the law enforcement, because we hear and we've heard survivors have been threatened, killed, or kidnapped for speaking up or being witnesses. Some of survivors from Nigeria, for example, who have been under voodoo contracts, are forced to disclose their madams, but the priority for the law enforcement is getting the madam, but not the consequences of denouncing these voodoo authors. And also on the service level, survivors of human trafficking, we need what everyone needs: safety, freedom, basic human rights, access to justice, and seeing accountability for perpetrators. As Katharina mentioned, that, but because of the trauma, the complicity of trauma that comes with exploitation, it makes our cooperation during the legal proceeding a little bit complex. So our first priority, if you want to get more quality or for survivors to be more cooperative, is put their mental health as one of the major priorities during legal proceedings. And it's also be customized to their needs. I know from experience that it's not only the physical wounds from exploitation that hurt the most, but also the invisible wounds that leaves victims and survivors vulnerable to re-exploitation, and sometimes it fosters them not to speak up. And also what I experienced during my surviving period is that the duration of support and assistance offered to victims and survivors during legal investigation is mainly linked to the survivors bearing witnesses to their trafficking experience. But when this support stops because they did not get the trafficker, which was happened in my case, this sudden removal of rights exposes survivors to more exposed to re-trafficking and re-traumatization. In my case, there was, as a minor, when I was rescued, it was mandatory because as a minor to be supported and taken to the safe house. But the transition from becoming 18 to an adult, my all rights to shelters, health or education was removed. This certain removal of rights to victims and the audacity of giving victims and survivors rights and then withdrawing them becomes more and more dangerous when it comes to mental health, because it gives us more trust to the pimps. Because then at one point I didn't know the difference between how the trafficker treated me and how the system treated me. So in order for us to come up with more survivor-centered justice approach, one major thing is survivor inclusion and engagement, and commitment to listen to survivors and act on their recommendation. Survivors are very significant in coming out with the best strategies that address prosecution, prevention, and prosecution, because they know firsthand what happened during, or tactics traffickers used to bound them in slavery. And we need also justice that is need-based. Effective justice is the justice that is right for the victim and the survivors, not right to the criminal justice. Survivors need to be seen as individuals with individual needs, but not that survivors have to depend on what the government think that they need. we need more collaboration between various stakeholders and service providers for us to ensure that victims and survivors have full survivors and access protection of their rights. And what was lacking during my identification and what I see with other survivors is we need to adopt a more compassionate, trauma-informed criminal justice system during legal proceeding, and understanding the cultures of different survivors. But at the same time, we need also increase in diversity among law enforcement. Because I think when I was interviewing, because of lack of why, I cannot speak up about certain things like prostitution, because to some survivors, that's re-stigmatizing yourself. There are some things that you do not just speak about because of how you were brought up or how you perceive exploitation. So we need diversity to represent more of a, we need diversity in law enforcement to represent the populations that are more vulnerable to human trafficking. And lastly, we need to remember that freedom is not only attained by removing physical chains or rescuing somebody or identifying them. Instead, freedom is an ongoing process that requires an long-term support of survivors and collaboration between the law enforcement, the COC, the health sector, working together for survivors to get a holistic kind of response to their needs. And also we need to facilitate or put in place alternative justice for survivors, having access to restoration programs, empowerment, mental health for survivors. Because without having kind of a collaborative way in supporting survivors, putting all these pathways for sustainable freedom, it leaves survivors more at risk of being re-exploited. Thank you.
Well, Malaika, thank you so much. And what a rich intervention. And, you know, I was, you know, the first part of the introduction when you said, you know, what happens when the criminal justice system is not really inclusive of survivors and survivors' ideas. They know best. And when that doesn't happen, you have a system that not only it causes, you know, not only does it not support survivors, but actually they could really nurture a situation whereby they could be re-traumatized, re-trafficked, just basically the opposite for what the criminal justice should do. And you would explain so nicely and so well all the things that really need to happen. And in a process that is not a one-off, it is a process that has to be led by survivors throughout. So it's a complete turnover of how many criminal justice systems really work. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I think we started to explore the how, you know, what needs to happen. You explained very well how this has to be addressed. You already started to explain as well. And to help us a little bit to explore further, you know, how we can turn the paradigm around the criminal justice in the cases of survivors of human trafficking, we have our last speaker, who is Phillipa Roberts. Phillipa is a lawyer by trade and the head of policy and research at Hope for Justice, and she's going to be speaking about holistic centered justice approaches. Phillipa has developed a multidisciplinary advocacy model providing social legal advocacy to survivors of modern slavery. She is now using her knowledge learned from frontline work to develop best practices to influence law and policy at national and international level. So thank you again, Phillipa, for joining us today. And this is your time to make your presentation.
Okay. I hope everybody can see that. So I completely agree with what all the speakers have said, and we just wanted to share with you some of an approach that we're taking in the UK on a programme called the Independent Modern Slavery Advocacy model, where we're taking really a survivor-centred, survivor justice-based and trauma-informed and rights-based approach. And it's a long-term model of providing independent advocacy and support that works with actually multiple stakeholders, both state actors such as the police and non-state actors, recognising the kind of multiple aspects to justice for a survivor. And the model was really the idea of survivors. Sorry, I can't. There we go. It came out of both a narrative and ongoing dialogue with survivors that we're working with in a long-term support project. And survivors are expressing they wanted a single point of trust to enable them better to understand their rights, voice their needs, and work with them through the multiple and often complex systems that they have to negotiate. And our experience with long term that survivors were falling through gaps in systems, but they were also experiencing multiple barriers to enable engagement with wider services, including having a lack of trust as the last person you trusted trafficked you, distrust of authorities such as the police, language or cultural barriers, mental health or learning disabilities. So really part of the role of the independent advocate was to build those bridges of trust between these agencies and the survivor, and also avoid, as Malaika mentioned, that having to repeat your story and your needs and what's happened to you. Also, we really recognise that the survivor's history and their journey of recovery is unique to them, and recovery is not linear, and therefore an independent advocate is able to flex to supporting the survivor to understand their rights and access the services that they voice they need at a point where they are ready in their own unique journey of recovery. But also a real important part is building capacity into the wider agencies such as criminal justice agencies through training to understand the needs of survivors and how to support them best. And we were part of drafting the survivor care standards, which are written with survivors and multiple agencies, particularly around best practices on supporting survivors in the criminal justice system. Also, by working with survivors through processes and right the way through to criminal and then on to civil, we're able to identify both good practice and also fractures in the systems and what isn't working well. So we can put evidence-based, survivor-informed recommendations to government on legislation, policy and practice, which positively impacts all survivors. So this is a diagram showing the potential legal and support needs that we see of survivors, and just to explain some of the bubbles on this, they're not reflective of the seriousness or importance. It's literally just a design feature, but we wanted to really show how these issues and legal issues and support needs really interconnect. So for instance, if somebody's immigration status is not secure, they will have real difficulty engaging with criminal justice, but often also have real difficulty accessing healthcare or housing and welfare, placing them at risk of being re-trafficked. If a person has criminal convictions as a result of their trafficking experience, that can affect their immigration status. If they don't have their basic needs met, such as welfare or housing, that impacts on security and safety, and survivors can't make decisions such as whether they do want to cooperate with the police. But the advocacy model, the clear aims of it really are to increase holistic justice for the survivor, increase their resilience, reduce risks of exploitation. But we've seen time and time again, this increases the chances of engagement of survivors with both criminal and civil justice processes. And really the role of advocacy is taking action to enable people to say what they want, secure their rights and pursue their interests and obtain the services they need. But that is very much in partnership with multiple organisations. And just to take an example of this, Amanda was one of the clients we have worked with. Amanda was trafficked into the UK by an organised crime gang and spent 5 years in sexual exploitation and a further number of years in an abusive marriage. And when we first met her, she was in a domestic violence refuge, and the refuge workers were at a loss to show how to move forward with her case. Despite being a European national, Amanda had no clear entitlements to welfare or move on housing, and she was threatened with homelessness as her licence at the refuge had come to an end. Her children, one of whom had special educational needs, had been unable to access education. And Amanda was struggling with her physical and mental health. She had no ID, had a memory of being arrested during her trafficking experience, but no further knowledge of whether there was a conviction. And at our initial assessment, when we asked Amanda what she wanted, she said she wanted to live a normal life with her family in a house with a garden in the countryside. She knew that green spaces would be good for her children and she would feel safer outside the city. But given her circumstances at the time, Amanda admitted this dream felt like an impossibility. But her case wonderfully demonstrates the impact that really specialist independent advocacy can have on a survivor's life. And we're pleased to report that several years on from first meeting her, she now does live independently in a house with a garden in a semi-rural location. Her children are in school and receiving the appropriate support, and Amanda is rebuilding her life. Independent advocacy played a vital role in navigating Amanda through the complexity of her situation, enabling her to understand her rights so she could make choices, and also providing solutions which unlocked options for her. And advocacy was required in all the areas highlighted on this web in yellow, but just to pick out some examples. Within a couple of months of working with Amanda, we had negotiated to ensure she would be safely housed in a refuge until a solution was found. We had supported her to liaise with the police in relation to reporting her trafficking experience and supporting her through that. And we'd made referrals to specialist solicitors, an immigration solicitor to secure her status in the UK, a special educational needs lawyer to ensure the children were enrolled in appropriate schools, a criminal solicitor is working to overturn Amanda's criminal convictions as an information request revealed a conviction as a result of her trafficking experience, and a compensation solicitor who's seeking to ensure that Amanda receives financial compensation for the abuse that she has suffered. Hope for Justice were also successfully able to advocate for entitlement to welfare based on complex EU legislation. And that demonstrated the overlap of the needs and how they all interrelate with each other, as these arguments were only possible when her children were in school. And Amanda had worked for several weeks in a supported employment project. So as you can see, that justice on lots of these areas really enabled Amanda to engage with criminal justice processes. And as Amanda says herself in the quote on the screen, I wouldn't be where I am now without you. I wouldn't have been able to engage with the police as I'd be too busy worrying about everything else. So what we see is by taking a holistic survivor justice approach and justice on every front, that we see that we are able to increase engagement and ongoing engagement with criminal and civil justice processes. So, for instance, within our advocacy model, 73% of people were able to engage with criminal justice, and 100% of survivors were called as witnesses and were able to attend trial. But equally, we've seen consistently that many of the survivors we work with would fall through gaps in systems, and 61% required advocacy to prevent issues of homelessness. We have worked with the University of Liverpool, who've independently evaluated the model, and the outcomes of that are, and survivors were interviewed obviously as part of the evaluation. And one of the parts of the evaluation identified a recommendation that working in partnership with other organisations, we should develop a formalised and accredited role in line with other independent advocacy services. So we're working with survivor organisations, but we're also working in partnership with the British Red Cross and the Snowdrop Project, who are really seasoned professionals working in this space, but also working with survivors and the wider sector to develop that model. And overall, we see that long term, if we want survivors to engage with criminal justice systems, then long-term advocacy and support is required. But as clearly mentioned by the other speakers, we also have to build capacity into criminal justice agencies to ensure that is a truly survivor-centred and trauma-informed approach. Thank you very much for listening. I think we're going to questions now.
Well, thank you so much, Phillipa, for providing a very specific, good practice and very practical way of supporting survivors through the system with an independent way of supporting their journey, and not just particular parts of the engagement with the criminal system. I think very much along Malaika's presentation. Okay, so now I can open the floor for questions and answers. For the audience, if you want to ask a question, I think you can go to reactions and raise your hand, and I will know that you really want to ask questions. I have a couple of questions already that have already been placed in the chat, so I think I will give you 1 second to raise your hand, try to find you on the panel, and then I will go. Okay, I do have a hand raised. Okay, Katharina, I'm sorry about the pronunciation. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay, we are the co-hosts. We are happy that Hope for Justice can raise this. We are very grateful. I've noticed that we have developed a lot of capacity in this area. I know in Uganda here, the issue of trafficking has also emerged internally, but also many of our young people are going to the Middle East, many big numbers. When it comes to justice issues, Trafficking Institute is helping the Director of Public Prosecution. What we don't see is the linkages being strengthened, coordination, networking, particularly to get the ideas from young people. What would be your support? But thank you so much for this expose. We are grateful.
Thank you, Katharina. Who are you addressing this question to?
Okay, I'm called Rogers Kasire. I'm the executive director.
Yeah.
We co-hosted with you. No problem. Yeah. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Katharina. No, my question is, who from the panel, from the three presenters, who would you like to answer to your question?
Maybe Robert, but anybody who is comfortable can respond. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, Malaika or Katharina or Phillipa, who would like to take up this question?
I mean, I can quickly say something, because I also saw that Katharina asked actually this very interesting question in the chat on how to build the capacity of law enforcement if you have victims that might not want to disclose information because of witchcraft rituals. And And what I want to highlight here, and Malaika actually touched upon this, is of course one, having diversity within law enforcement and criminal justice practitioners, but also the engagement of cultural mediators that can understand the social and cultural context. And this is a constant challenge. I mean, we as the OSCE, we're having our flagship training, the simulation-based training exercises, where we bring together practitioners from all groups that are needed for an effective human trafficking response. We bring prosecutors, we bring police, we bring social workers, we bring lawyers, asylum authorities, and they all have to do one thing: work together to solve the case. Sometimes it does work, sometimes it doesn't. But of course, it's not the mandate of the police officer to understand the fully social or cultural context of the victim. And he might not have the time to do so, because he has to focus on the investigation. But this is why we advocate for a multi-agency approach that also includes, in the context, in the situation that Katharina explained, cultural mediators. And very often there's a confusion, and this is what we have seen in our trainings, between a cultural mediator and an interpreter. An interpreter is just supposed to interpret word by word without putting a meaning behind it. But this is exactly the task of the cultural mediator. He's not supposed to translate word by word, but he's supposed to explain the police officer why the victim maybe behaves X, Y, Z, or what the response might mean. So this is quickly my response, but I also saw that Malaika turned on her camera.
Yes,
thank you. Thank you, Catherine. I agree with what you say. It's all about different actors working together for the victim to get that holistic response. But I'll just also add some example, especially when it comes to the voodoo situation. For example, in Nigeria, Nigerian victims, one of the highest percentage of survivors in sexual exploitation is under a voodoo oath. And what Europe also decided to do collectively is work not only with cultural leaders, but also spiritual religious leaders. We saw, I think, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they had to work collaboratively with it's called Oba, the chief priest, the voodoo priest in Nigeria, to denounce all the voodoo curses that have been constraining survivors to speak up. Of course, it psychologically it helped, although there's still a bit of constraint, but working together with both cultural leaders and spiritual leaders. And what we do here in the Netherlands is that we also work collaboratively with religious leaders. Since the voodoo contrast and maybe Christianity or Islam is that one suppresses the other. So sometimes for them to get a piece of psychological comfort, we also bring in, if a pastor can help you to pray over your situation for you to get secure enough to pray about it, and maybe then you can speak up. I can agree that Catherine said a very complex situation, because the mental capacity of somebody enslaved with a voodoo contract really depends on that individual. So it's all about putting their needs and safety first, because what the police enforcement do, they bring this scientific approach that, of course, nothing is going to happen to you. They do not consider their mental health. So working collaboratively and also training this law enforcement about the different forms of voodoo, and actually working alongside survivors. Also, what we've done is that we engage survivors as mentors who have been through this process. For example, one who was under a voodoo oath, to speak, support, and mentor somebody who is still in transition on being free. Yeah, that can also help.
Thank you, Malaika. Phillipa, you have your hand raised for a minute. I don't know if you still want to react to this.
Sorry, I can't turn my camera off at the moment. On at the moment. Yeah, I put my hand down because I felt the question had been quite eloquently answered I think there's an importance of holistic cultural competence in working with survivors through the criminal justice system, and that cultural competence can transcend lots of different areas. A survivor's understanding of the justice system from their own perspective, an understanding of these issues around cultural issues around witchcraft, and wider issues. So, and we've actually seen organisations in the UK do that training for police officers to really understand some of those issues and therefore the barriers that actually people have, because these are very, very high level coercive controlling mechanisms that can really kind of impede survivors coming forward in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Phillipa. Thank you, everybody, for your very thorough reply. I've got a comment from Damanita from KMWSC in India, and she's asking about the role of NGOs in this process. Damanita, I'm not sure which part of the process you were referring to, because maybe you were reacting to something that was said at the time. I don't know if you want to elaborate on this question.
Yes, so if I could elaborate, it's that we are working with the survivors, and we have just, because we usually have worked with the sensitization of trafficking projects in Indo-Bangladesh border areas. So recently we have started working with the survivors. So the problem we are having is in that area there are multiple NGOs who are working, and the issue is there are kind of it's having a borderline issues that which is who survivors, and there is a parameters. So I feel the main objective we are missing is the importance of survivors. So what should be the role defined for NGOs? How should they move forward and work as jointly to kind of solve the issue?
Thank you very much, Namarisa. Who do you want to address your question to?
It can be an open forum. If anybody could contribute, that would be an help.
Right. So presenters, the floor is open for any of you who wants to react to this.
I mean, if I may, I want to share, and I can share in the chat, we have published 2 or 3 years ago, I find an excellent paper that speaks exactly about what Nabanita just asked, the critical role of the civil society in combating human trafficking, which explains the importance of looking at NGOs beyond just engaging them once it comes to providing assistance and shelter to victims, because they also have expertise that could be brought into during the investigation and the prosecution. But also, and this is something that had been seen, sometimes it is not necessary to, for example, call again a victim to ask for testimony. It could be, for example, also a service provider or caseworker that could provide this information. So we have this paper, and I will share the link to the paper in the chat, and it really examines the role of civil society beyond just seeing them as a service provider that you engage to provide shelter.
Thank you very much, Katharina. We will share the link as well with participants later on as well as on the chat. Phillipa.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the role of civic society is much wider than providing support. It's actually building that capacity and knowledge into law enforcement. So an example of the way we did that, for instance, on one of the large cases that we worked on, is we really supported the police to really just understand more about the situation in terms of the case, but also enable them to understand better how to support survivors, understand better the issues of trauma that survivors were experiencing. So I think, yeah, there's multiple ways we can really support law enforcement. I think the key thing is working together, both law enforcement, civic society organisations, survivors really working together, and where we see survivors well supported, including in the criminal justice system, it's where agencies are really working collaboratively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Malaika, do you want to add to this, or should we just go to the next question?
Yes, I wanted to just highlight on one of the most significant stakeholders that miss in this collaboration is working with survivors, survivor-led initiatives. there are different organizations. Footprint to Freedom is a survivor-led organization that works with consultation, which is 100% led by survivors and managed by survivors. We have survivor alliances, we have ISTAC. So leveraging on the experiences and the expertise of survivors as partners, you as an NGO, is very essential to inform your practices, to kind of review your programs before you put them in place. For example, one thing that is missing is the strength-based approach that can be internalized in your programs for a survivor to be able to be empowered enough to speak up. And the only person who can look at the missing links in your program's outreach is using the lens of lived experience. So what I would recommend is leveraging on lived experience. As consultants, employ survivors within your organizations, not only as beneficiaries to your services, but contributors to the prevention.
Thank you very much. And I really take the challenge, and not the challenge, but the suggestion very much at heart. Often civil society talk a lot about survivor inclusion, and we ourselves are not really living up to the core principles that we are asking other actors to live up to. I totally understand that. And that will really yield for another long conversation, Malaika. So thank you very much for bringing it up. I've got a question that is, I'm combining two questions because I think they are very, very related. So Anna Nabulia from UIDL in Uganda says that it's important to include family support and reintegration to support recovery and breaking the vicious cycle of poverty. And then Alex, from CEO of Child Smile, she says that as we deal with survivors, we also need to think about the children of the survivors, since we always do the rescues and bring back someone who is really mentally ill, can't even support themselves. And the question is, what should be done to support the children of the survivors until they get on their feet? Question is open for anyone, I suppose, on the panel, Alex, unless you really want to elaborate on the question.
Maybe I'll just jump in quickly. For what Footprint does is that when survivors are integrated back into their communities, repatriated or go back home after exploitation, is giving them the empowerment skill training. Because if we focus on all the people around, like the family members, the children, to be also being taken care of, it becomes a bit difficult. We focus on empowering and giving the survivor the tools they need to become sustainable. For example, we have entrepreneurial skills. It can be maybe in fashion and design, or computer, or making art and craft, or a gift pack through microfinance. When this survivor is equipped and has the economic resources, she can be able to transfer this economic independence to her family. So one thing that I've noticed, that I'm a Ugandan, that we've got this dependence that, how can I say it? That instead of teaching survivors to fish, we give them the fish every time, and then somehow our ponds run dry because we depend on donations, and donations stop at one point. For me, I believe in teaching someone to fish in order for them to be able to fish for themselves. And this economic and also empowerment, at the same time, the attitude that we have around our communities. What is empowerment? It's not to be given all the time, but get the tools to go fishing. And for example, all I needed for me in order, when I was surviving, I was unemployed, I didn't have an income, I didn't have a house. All I needed was to go to school. Everyone has got their own need for them to get economic or independence. And since I got that, I'm able to get a job and sustain my family and take care of my mental health. So my advice is less focus on the immediate need, that is the survivor. Empower her mentally, psychologically, and economical needs. Give them the tools they need to be independent, to be able to transfer this independence to the children. And this is, I think, the only way we can break the generational vulnerability, because we're tapping in to the main source rather than focusing on the children and their relatives.
Well, thank you very much, Malaika. I think we're coming to the end of this conversation. Time has flown by. I would like to give each of your panelists 30 seconds for your last remarks before we close, and hopefully this will be just one of many conversations on this hugely important issue. So maybe I would start with in the same order as we presented. So Katharina, please.
I actually want to use my 30 seconds to say something to Alex. If he could share his email address in the chat, because I came across this very interesting case from Italy, where a Nigerian woman was denied the parental rights of her children because the court considered herself unable to take care of her children. So it might be very interesting for him to just maybe read the case in response to his question. So I just wanted to use this quickly, so if he could share his email address, I can send him this. And I want to thank both you from Hope for Justice, but also the Uganda Youth Development Link for inviting us today and for giving us the opportunity to advocate once more for the importance of victim-centered approaches, and for not just listening to survivors, but engaging the survivors, because I think we have to go beyond just listening to them. We have to recognize them for the expertise and the experience that none of us have. So this was it from my side.
Thank you very much, Katharina, and very, very good. You know, you managed two reactions in 30 seconds, and it is us who have to thank you so much for your participation today. Malaika, this is over to you.
I think I would just like to thank everyone for their contribution. I learned also from sharing, also being present. But the only remark is that we have to look also beyond victim-centered, survivor-centered, but then to look at the whole community approach, because either way, it takes the whole village. So we should stop boxing ourselves into these ideologies, but work as a community. In this way, we can be able to do more.
Thank you so much, Malaika. Phillipa?
I couldn't agree more, Malaika, on that, in terms of it's about taking a whole community approach and a multi-discipline, a multi-agency approach, but actually placing survivors absolutely at the center of approaches. They have so much to contribute to legislation, policy, and practice, and that's, you know, for all of us who either work in the sector or work in the criminal justice sector or any sector, it's an important reminder of the importance of placing survivors at the center of everything that we do, but the important role as experts in the field that they play in contributing and developing programs, models, and approaches to effectively end slavery.
Well, thank you very much, the three of you. Thank you also all of you who attended and were so active in posting your comments and sharing your expertise as well. And I would like to thank Hope for Justice and the Uganda Youth Development Link for hosting and organizing this event. And I will special mention to Robin Heitzman for making all this possible for us. The recording of today's presentation will be posted on YouTube, and if you want to share with other colleagues, please do. And I wish you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.